Begin. Hello everybody, welcome to the last of our IFR workshops in the PilotEdge workshop series. This is number 5. This will go for about 2 hours or so, and we will be covering the exciting world of holding, lost communications, and if you're not asleep by then, the preferred routes within Southern California. Lost comms is probably one of the most highly debated topics that I know of in the field of IFR. We might get into that more during the Q&A, but I will at least cover the basics, the stuff which is really hard to debate and set in stone. We will cover during the core of this, but some of the more esoteric discussions about what to do once you actually get to the destination and what happens if you get there early, a lot of those things have that's where it starts getting highly debated. But there's a good amount of it which is not really debated, so that's the part which we'll cover during the core. As I said, holding and lost comms will probably be the meat of this, and preferred routes are, at least in my mind, relatively simple, so I don't think we'll have to spend too much time on them. But holding and lost comms are where it's at for most of the material this evening. So we shall go ahead and begin, and we'll be covering them in that order. All right, so you've got to know when to hold them. I've always wanted to use that line from Kenny Rogers tune. My dad will be thrilled that I've included a Kenny Rogers reference, considering I hated Kenny Rogers growing up. But in any case, so when are holds used? You probably haven't encountered them too much when flying on the network, and it's also likely that if you fly real world, you probably haven't encountered them too much either, unless you're an air carrier a pilot or an air transport pilot. So when there's serious flow problems, if the weather goes downhill, which typically results in the arrival rate for airports diminishing as they transition from visual approaches with fairly close spacing to reducing the number of active runways they're using for arrivals. Basically, the arrival rate goes down. There's still the same number of planes in the air, and things start backing up, and that's when they start holding aircraft. If the weather changes or the wind changes and they need to change runways, holding gets used while they sort everything out. I actually have an interesting video of that. If anyone wants to review that during the Q&A, I have some really neat radar tracks from Newark Airport where they change from landing on 22 left to landing on 4 right, and it takes about 2 hours for that process to happen end to end before all the holds stop. If there's a temporary airport closure, if there's an emergency, those are all reasons why holds might get used. They're also used, the thing which would affect us the most as general aviation pilots would be if you have just 2 people flying to a non-towered airport, or 1 person flying out of a non-towered airport with 1 person arriving at that non-towered airport. Under IFR, because of the 1 in and 1 out procedures that get used at non-towered airports, only one of those people is going to be able to use the airspace at a time, and the other person will have to hold. So take the simple case of 2 planes arriving at, say, Catalina or Corona or something like that. 1 person gets the approach clearance and the other person gets a hold. So that would be typically when you would encounter, as a general aviation pilot, it's going to be during it's the result of 1 in and 1 out procedures at non-towered fields, which are going to hit you most of the time with holds. The rest of them, in my experience, I have never been affected by a hold for those other reasons that are listed there. It's just never affected me as a general aviation pilot. I don't know, has anybody here fly IFR and have experienced a hold before? And if so, what was the reason? Go ahead and text it if you do have one, otherwise I shall move on. Okay, so that's when holds are generally used, and hold entries are used during approaches a lot. And we covered that in grim detail when we're looking at instrument approaches. So it's not that you'll be holding at a fix for any length of time, but you will be mimicking the first part of the hold, which is the entry. So there's 2 very distinct phases of a hold. One is maneuvering to enter the hold, that's phase 1, and the second is the steady state hold. And when you're shooting instrument approaches, that first part is used routinely. So you're maneuvering for the hold. It's the hold in lieu of the procedure turn, for example, on the ILS 19 right at John Wayne. We've looked at that a zillion times now over at Snake, I believe it is, or Sega. And you never actually end up spending any time in a steady state hold under normal circumstances, but you will have to know how to do the hold entry. So we will be covering hold entries on page 4, I believe. But before that, I want to talk about steady state holds. So ignoring for a minute the considerable amount of work that goes into entering the hold, I'd like to discuss some of the details about a hold in clearance, what they sound like, what each of the terms mean, and published versus unpublished holds. So don't worry too much about how you're going to enter the hold, whether it's a direct or a parallel or a teardrop or some other procedure that you come up with on the fly. I've seen plenty of those. Won't worry about that just yet. Let's just talk about the details of a hold itself. So before you can hold at a particular spot, and you can hold at all sorts of things, by the way. You can hold at a VOR, you could hold at a fix or an intersection, you could hold at an NDB, you could hold at a DME fix relative to a VOR. So you could hold 10 miles west of a VOR where there is no actual fix published. It'd be kind of evil, but they could do it. So that is your clearance limit. That is where the plane is effectively holding, this fictional spot or an imaginary spot where the plane, in ATC's mind, has essentially paused. And that's essentially the goal of a hold, by the way. ATC doesn't really care how tight you're turning, what your bank angle is, how fast you're going. As far as they're concerned, you have stopped. That's really the goal of a hold. Not sure if you've ever tried stopping a 747 in the midair. It's a mistake you make precisely just one time, and then you never try it again. So you can't stop. So the nearest best thing you can do is just fly around in circles in a known area or covering a known amount of distance. That's effectively the same thing as stopping. So believe it or not, ATC doesn't care as much about the details of your holding as you might think they do. You know, we really don't care how fast you're flying or how much you slow down, etc. We don't have anyone else in that racetrack at the same altitude as you in the same area. So you're not literally flying around a racetrack like cars on a NASCAR track. You will have altitude or vertical separation or lateral separation that's very generous. If they are holding aircraft on multiple points along an airway, those airways will be relatively quite far apart. So just so you know, we're not looking for that. We're not examining the holds at that level, at least from the controller's perspective. But your plane is essentially paused, again, over a clearance limit. That's the most important thing with a hold. Then there's the direction relative to the clearance limit. So acknowledging that you can't physically stop the airplane, we need to know where you're going to be basing, which way you're going to be turning in the hold, and are you going to be going up, down, or left or right of that clearance limit. That'll become a little bit more clear when we look at this on a sectional in just a second, but let me continue going through this list for now. So we've got our clearance limit, the direction relative to the clearance limit, such as north, south, east, or west, whether we will be turning left or right once we're established in the hold, and this is where people just go nuts when they realize that sometimes to enter a hold that will be involving right turns, you may be making a series of left turns to enter the hold. So again, vitally important that you separate the concept of maneuvering for the hold versus being in the hold and then making those left or right turns in the hold. So there's three very important parts of that. The fourth part is the leg length. This may or may not be specified by ATC. If it's not specified by ATC, then it is implied based upon, I believe it's altitude. It's typically 1 minute. I think it's 1 minute for if you're at a certain altitude, and then it goes to about 1.5 minutes if you're if you're above that altitude. The reason I'm being so vague about that is that I've never had to care. I'm not flying high enough to be in the area. I think it might be 14,000 or even above that, where it defaults to 1.5 minutes for the leg length. So if you picture this as a racetrack, so a straight 180-degree turn, a straight, and another 180-degree turn. When we talk about leg length, we're talking about how long the legs are essentially, specifically the inbound. The inbound leg. There may be times when you have to adjust the outbound leg in terms of time to guarantee that the inbound leg will be that target amount of time. So depending on the winds, you might actually end up flying a 45-second outbound to end up with a 1-minute inbound. So it's the inbound leg length that we're essentially concerned with. And this number at the end, the EFC time, when to expect further clearance. So this is when you can expect from a lost communications perspective to be leaving the hold. It actually bears very little resemblance to reality. It's not when you will, despite the name, it's not when you can expect to leave the hold, despite them calling it, and expect further clearance time. It really is for lost communications. So if the radio goes dead, this is the time which you can leave the hold and continue on your way. But practically speaking, at least in my experience, that you end up leaving the hold considerably before that time, and they'll tell you when that is. Okay, so those are the elements that you must know as a part. You cannot really enter a hold until you know all of those things. Now, that's not to say that ATC is going to spoon feed you every single part of that. Every one of those elements. Again, some of them can be implied, such as the leg length, or in the case of a published hold, which is what we're about to look at, some of it may be charted. So the direction of turns, for example, is charted in a published hold. So ATC can actually skip issuing that along with the leg length. But as a pilot, those 5 things you must know prior to entering a hold. Otherwise, you will be in some form of trouble. Okay, so let's have a look at what a sample holding clearance from ATC will sound like, and see if we can identify those elements that we just talked about. Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, cleared to the Ventura VOR, hold northwest on Victor 27 as published. Expect further. Editing on the fly. Expect further clearance at 2100, time now 2030. Okay, so here is our clearance limit. The hint was we were cleared to that point, so no big surprise, that's our clearance limit. So this is where we are essentially paused over. Here is our direction. Hold northwest on Victor 27, and we're going to look at a map really quickly to investigate that part in a bit more detail, because this is another part that trips people up quite a bit. So hold northwest on Victor 27 as published. Here's our EFC, along with a time check. So as you can see, there's a 30-minute difference between the time now and the time when we expect further clearance. So let's jump right now to question 2 before I look to the map. Are we actually going to have to wait for 30 minutes? No, it's unlikely that we'll end up actually waiting for 30 minutes. If, in the worst case scenario, if our radio fails, and again, there's always so many rules in IFR, get back to lost comms. If our radio fails, they will be expecting us to leave that hold at the top of the hour. So if we lose our comms while we're maneuvering in that hold and the radio stops working, we don't need to panic. We know exactly when we're going to leave the hold, which will be at the top of the hour. What we do after that, we'll leave for the lost comms section of the talk. Okay, so let's go back and see if we can identify all the elements and see if anything's missing. Okay, so we said we needed a clearance limit. Check, Ventura VOR. We said we needed direction relative to the clearance limit. Hold northwest on Victor 27, check. So that's 2. Direction of turns. Apparently missing. Leg length. Apparently missing. Expect further clearance. Check. So 2 of the items are missing. We don't know what the leg lengths are, or I should say we have not been told what the leg lengths are, and we have not been told direction of turns. So I chose this example specifically because I wanted to show that what ATC issues you may seem on the surface incomplete. And so you may be forgiven for thinking, oh, the controller forgot that. Let me ask him, did you want left or right turns? And how long do you want the legs to be? And both of those questions would be a mistake. They may not bite your head off for it. They'll give you the information, but it was technically not needed, and you should have been able to derive that info. Let's go have a look at the left versus right turns. We'll work that out. Okay, I'm looking at the L3 low en route chart for Southern California, and I'm centered right now over the Ventura VOR. And you'll notice there's an airway Victor 27. Let me get myself a pointer here. So all of our discussion is going to be happening in here. And you'll notice on Victor 27, which is this airway right here, the 311 radial, off of Ventura, we have a published hold. That's what this racetrack is. So the valuable piece of information we're getting from this is the direction of the turns. This is telling us that the published hold on Victor 27 is left turns. Standard direction for holds are normally right turns. So this is going to be left turns instead of right turns. Anyone hazard a guess as to why they're having us make left turns for this hold instead of right turns? Right, Risa said Victor 25. Laurie says terrain. Calvin says better visibility. Assuming we're an IMC, you can assume visibility is not going to come into it for IFR. I don't know the exact answer, but I'm going to guess might have something to do with this. And I'm not being sarcastic. I really am guessing. I don't know, but restricted area 2519 is here. There's a lot of high performance departures out of Point Mugu Naval Air Station right there. If we swap over to the LAX sectional, yeah, I click on it and I get a little smudge on the LA button. Tells me I'm in the wrong mode. I'll get the hang of this annotating one day. There it is. Okay, there's Point Mugu Naval Air Station. The VOR is here-ish, right there. And so if we were to come in on Victor 27 and make right turns, if we're flying a fairly fast airplane and the winds are out of the northeast, blah, 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 we could easily get blown into restricted area 2519. Okay. It really is amazing how much simpler low en route charts are visually than sectional charts. It never ceases to amaze me. Okay, so it's left turns. So again, let's look at what's going on. The spirit of what's going on here is TC wants us here. That's really what's going on here. Again, they can't make the plane stop, so the compromise is they're going to have us hold in a very predictable pattern. And what this is effectively going to look like is we're going to be holding on Victor 27. Don't be fooled by this little racetrack being off to the side. We're not actually going to be flying the plane over here in that tight little circle. So while many things are to scale and are literal on low en route charts, the physical positioning of that racetrack is not significant. It's purely for legibility. We're certainly not going to be holding all the way out there. What we will be doing, if we wanted to know what it would look like physically, is something like this. This is the inbound leg. We hit the VOR, we make a left 180-degree turn. It'll be a 311 heading outbound for whatever the leg length corrected for wind is. For argument's sake, I'm going to say that's a minute for us. It'll be a minute the first time around, and then we'll make a 180-degree turn to join Victor 27 inbound. And from the time we are making a little cross here, and a cross there, and a cross there, to just highlight the different segments. So these are supposed to be straight lines, and these are our 180-degree turns. This guy right here, the one that is inbound, we'll call this the inbound leg. Draw an arrow for that. That inbound leg ideally should be 1 minute long. Let's assume the winds are blowing from the southeast really, really hard. And when we first fly this, we notice that from the time we go inbound, from the time we hit the inbound leg till the time we actually cross over the VOR, it actually is 1 minute and 10 seconds. So it took us 10 seconds longer to fly this inbound than it did the outbound. We would then adjust the outbound length such that on the second time around, theoretically, the inbound leg should only take 1 minute. Now you can drive yourself absolutely bonkers trying to do this. And if you're hand flying the plane and it's turbulent and you're an IMC, I'm just going to come right out and say that I wouldn't care. I wouldn't care if my leg length was 55 seconds or 1 minute and 5 seconds or even 1 minute and 10 seconds. I'm not sure if that makes me a bad pilot or not. I'd have to check with a double I to see if they think that's sacrilegious or not. But it can be enough work just keeping the plane in the air and dealing with turbulence and fuel and other things that you're having to balance. What is really most important, whether this leg is 1 minute long or 1 minute and 5 seconds or 1 minute 10, etc. What's really a whole lot more important is that your plane is over here. This is called the holding side. So we have this holding track. This is the inbound leg where my mouse is moving up and down. So from Victor 27 to the east, that is the holding side. From Victor 27 to the west is the non-holding side. The most important thing is that your plane remains, not surprisingly, on the holding side, hence the term. If you end up on the non-holding side, something has gone wrong. And in the very, very worst case scenarios, it can kill you. It probably won't kill you around Ventura. The terrain's really not that high from memory. But there are some places where if you end up on the non-holding side, your terrain separation goes away. So the altitude that they've got you holding at may not work if you end up turning the wrong way. So it is really, really important to understand. This is why visualizing holds is so important. And this is a whole lot easier to do on the ground than it is in the airplane, I can tell you. But it is an important skill to understand where are we going to be holding, what's the direction of the hold, and is it left or right turns? Because if you mess up any of those three things, it can literally kill you in the worst case. In the best case scenario, ATC is going to yell at you at the very least, and somewhere in the middle is where you just lose your maybe you lose your ticket, something like that. So I think I have the order around the wrong way around actually. Somewhere in the middle is ATC yelling at you, and then no, I had it the right way around. Worst case, you die. Second worst case, you lose your ticket, and at the very least, you're going to get barked at. There we go. See, I should have written that down before the presentation. Okay, any questions about what is going on there so far with the concepts that we have introduced? So we've got the holding side versus non-holding side, the inbound leg, the outbound leg, and left turns versus right turns. How is that sitting so far? Kidoki. Right, if anybody has any issues, feel free to type them and I will look for them in the text. Okay, so what I want to, the last part I want to cover with holding before we talk about hold entries is this notion of holding northwest. I'm sorry, that's for a published hold. Yeah, we said hold northwest on Victor 27. So what do they mean when we say hold northwest? What's the significance of that? The significance is that the vast majority of the hold is occurring to the northwest of the Ventura VOR. That's what that means. So if that's our holding track and this is the VOR, notice that for 95% of the time or 90% of the time, our airplane is physically located northwest of the VOR. The only time when we're not northwest of the VOR is when we cross over the VOR. We then initiate a turn, 180-degree turn to the left. During that time, we're passing through southeast, then east, then northeast, and it might event, that might actually take us slightly southeast of the VOR, just marginally. That's fine. But the vast majority of the hold is happening up there. If they had said hold southeast on Victor 27, then things would look quite different. That depicted hold would go away, and a hold southeast on Victor 27 at least the default one, if they didn't give us a direction of turns, remember it's right turns by default, would end up looking like this. So they could do that. Notice that they never actually mentioned a radial. So the clearance could have literally been Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo cleared to the Ventura VOR, hold southeast on Victor 27, expect further clearance, etc. Again, they didn't include the direction of turns, but it's implied to be right turns. And they didn't give us leg lengths, again, same thing. And there's no mention of a radial. Both in the first clearance there was no radial, and on the second clearance there was no mention of a radial. They're still giving us the direction of the hold and the holding course by reference to the airway. So I'm going to, just for clarity, I'm going to get rid of my annotation there so we can read, and that would be holding on the 129 radial. So it's easy to visualize this when there's an airway sitting right there. So when we say hold southeast on Victor 25, it's not that hard to visualize that. Where it really can get tricky, okay, now the annotating tool decides to take one of my holding patterns and turn it to an oval. Thank you for that. Where it can really become hard to visualize is when you get an unpublished hold, i.e. there's no visual depiction of the hold whatsoever, on a random radial. So now you don't even have an airway to base this on. So let's go ahead and make one of those up, and then we'll be ready to move on. But this is about as difficult as it gets. Quite honestly, I have issued 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these on PilotEdge since we opened a year and a half ago, and 4 out of the 5 times that I've issued these, they have been flown incorrectly by the pilot. And in 1, 2, 3, 4 of the cases out of those 5, those pilots were current instrument pilots, real-world instrument pilots. So that's how tricky this stuff can be when you're actually trying to operate the airplane, whether it's a real plane or the sim. Okay, so let's have a look at an unpublished hold. It's kind of a oxymoron to have a look at an unpublished hold, but basically I'm trying to pick a random place to issue a hold. Okay, I got it. Let's say we're tootling along towards San Marcos, and for argument's sake, I'm going to assume we're down here. So this is our airplane. We're on a random route, and we're heading that way. I failed 4th grade art, if that's not obvious, to the San Marcos VOR. And we receive the following. Don't worry, they'll actually give you a hint that it's coming. And I'll tell you 2 things that might make you feel a bit better. The first is they are required to give you these holding instructions 5 minutes or more prior to you reaching the clearance limit. So if we were literally 60 seconds, let's say we were actually here. I'm just going to make a small mark because I don't want it to distract us too much. Let's just assume we were here, and we're literally just a minute and a half or 60 seconds from San Marcos. They are not going to say, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, cleared to the San Marcos VOR, hold on the XXX radial, or hold northeast on the XXX radial, expect further clearance, whatever. Not many people would be able to process it that quickly, and it would result in a safety of flight issue. You're either going to have a deviation, or you might kill yourself scrambling to try and work all that out, and you might forget to fly the plane. So the FAA was smart enough to say, look, let's not put undue burden on the pilots. Let's put some of the responsibility on ATC. You cannot just give someone it's basically a last-minute hold. You cannot throw that on them at the last minute. You've got to give them at least 5 minutes. They need to be more than 5 minutes or more from the holding fix. So let's assume we are doing about 120 knots. That's 10 miles a minute. Let's assume we're about 12, 13, 14, 15 miles southeast of San Marcos, and we receive the following clearance. Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, I have holding instructions for you. Advise ready to copy. A controller is likely to give you that. They're likely to give you a heads up. Not only is it going to be more than 5 minutes away from you, they're actually going to tell you that the next instruction you're going to get is a holding clearance, because they're fairly lengthy and they want you to be prepared to copy. Whereas a pilot who's normally en route, the last thing they're expecting, unless they've been hearing everybody else get holds ahead of them, the last thing they're actually expecting is a hold. So if you're the first guy to get a hold, you're the last one expecting it, put it that way. You know, you might get a speed reduction, you might get a turn, you might get a climb or a descent, but you're not really expecting a hold. So chances of you having a pencil in your hand ready to go are slim. So a more experienced controller is likely to say, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, I have holding instructions for you, advise ready to copy. You'll say standby. You reach for your pencil, make sure you've got a notepad, take a deep breath, and you go, okay, we're ready to copy. And then you get Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo cleared to the San Marcos VOR, hold northeast on the 040 radial. Expect further clearance at 2100, time now 2030. So the chart is not helping us one iota. There's no airways referenced in that. There's no hold published at San Marcos. So what did the controller give us? They gave us we're going to be holding northeast on the 040 radial. Let's look at exactly what that means. 1, 2, 3, 4. There it is there. Okay, what's the default direction of turns in the hold? Is it left or right? Correct. Right turns. So Moon said it's inbound 040, left turns. Is it left turns for this? No, it is right turns. And I'm glad you tried throwing a heading out there, Moon, because this is where the big debates start. So we were told to hold northeast on the 040 radial. Okay, does that mean we'll be heading inbound? Inbound on a 040 heading or bearing to the station, and then making right turns, i.e. something like this. Don't hold me to the headings exactly, but is this what we're going to be doing? Are we going to be heading northeast to the station and then heading southwest on the way out? You might think that because you heard 040, you think, okay, 040 inbound, that's northeast, etc. But if we step back and look at the big picture, where is the plane holding relative to the VOR? Where are we spending most of our time the way I've drawn this hold right now? This is all happening southwest. We're now holding southwest of the VOR. That's bad. We were told that we would be holding northeast of the VOR. So don't get too caught up on the numbers. Ignore the 040 for a minute. If you were told to hold northeast of this VOR and we ended up flying it like this, we're doing the polar opposite of what ATC called for. Correct. So the inbound course on this hold is actually going to be 220. That's right. It's the reciprocal of the whatever radial you are told to hold on. Yep. So if we draw this again, the 040 is essentially going to be the outbound heading. This is actually a little bit hard to draw. It's going to be easier if I draw the inbound first, believe it or not. 1, 2, 3, 4. I do want to make it accurate if I can. That's the 040 radial right there. Hit the VOR, right turns by default, 040. Please turn this into a pretty oval. Oh, my drawing was so bad it couldn't. Sorry, I'm left-handed, believe it or not, but I use the mouse with my right hand, so me trying to draw this is just a train wreck. In fact, that's so bad, I'm going to have to try again, because anyone looking at that, I may be hurting more than I'm helping there. You know, I might actually draw it as a rectangle. That might just be easier. There we go. That's probably a little bit better. That is what the holding actually looks like. That is holding northeast of the VOR on the 040 radial. Now, there is a time where we are not on the 040 radial. Let's talk about whether that's okay or not. You can't be on the 040 radial the entire time. You can't be on it on the inbound and the outbound. So the only time you have to be on the 040 radial, and the 040 radial is a perfectly straight line that goes out that way, is for the inbound leg. So all of that is a reference to the inbound leg. which is a pity because the only time you're actually flying a heading of 040 is when you're on the outbound part. So there's a couple of different ways to try and remember this. When you're given a holding clearance like this, the number that you hear, so that hold northeast on the 040 radial, you can either interpret the 040 as the outbound heading, which is accurate, or you can just try and picture the 040 radial, and that part is for the inbound portion, and then the rest kind of takes care of itself. So the inbound heading is going to be the reciprocal of the number they gave you. If that's too hard to remember, then just try and remember, okay, the number they give you is the outbound heading only. So pick your battle. Okay, Moon is saying 040 outbound is not on the actual radial though. That's 100% correct. And yeah, there's a very, very important point. Again, the only time you're physically on the 040 radial, which is that spot right there where my mouse is moving, is when you're inbound. So I should draw that. You know what, let me just throw an arrow on there so I at least give you a fighting chance. You can see I'm putting love into this. I'm doing it very slowly for once. There we go. So the only time you're on the 040 is when you're inbound. That's correct. Then we make a right turn, and we make a right turn because the controller did not say to make left turns. That's right. So flying this is not difficult. That's not the hard part. Knowing what you should fly is the hard part. That's the tough one. Anyone can fly straight and chuck a Yui, fly straight and chuck a Yui. That's not hard. But knowing what headings you're supposed to be on and when is the difficult part. So hold visualization is the most important thing. Then flying it is sort of secondary. But you can see the thing that's going to get you in trouble is, oh, I'm not a very good pilot. I have trouble making these 180-degree turns. Sometimes I make 90-degree turns instead. Nobody will ever say that. The mechanics of flying this are very easy. It all comes down to the visualization. So that's the part you should focus on when you start practicing holds. Know that flying it is going to be easy. The hard part is visualizing. So if you ever want to kind of practice this stuff, just literally do what I did. Pick a VOR or even a fix, preferably something not on an airway, and throw out a random radial and come out with a holding clearance, and just sort of draw the hold from there. And see how you do. See if you can visualize it. I have to be honest, I have not had to deal with this before in flight, so I don't actually practice this as much as I should. The only holds that instrument pilots are practicing on a regular basis is usually the missed approach hold, and that's cheating because it's all published for you, and there's really not a whole lot to visualize. You have to visualize the entry, which we're about to cover next, but you have the actual hold depicted right there in front of you. So, you've got the racetrack right there, and it just sort of removes any ambiguity. So again, let's go revisit our original hold and see how much easier it is to interpret that now that we're all holding experts. Yeah, so when we let's revisit that original holding clearance. So cleared to the Ventura viewer. Here's Ventura down here. I'll move it to the center of the screen, I apologize. So here's Ventura. So we're cleared to the Ventura VOR, hold northwest on Victor 27 as published, expect further clearance at 2100, time now 2030. Okay. Even if you can't quite remember if it was northwest, northeast, southwest, what did he say? Well, it was as published. That's awesome. Let's whip out the low en route chart. Cool, there it is right there. It's going to be Victor 27, the 311 radial, and that hold that I'd been awkwardly trying to draw up there on the top left before is already drawn for us. So the visualization is already done for you. That's why published holds really are so much easier than unpublished holds. Okay, before we move into the magical world of hold entries, any questions about what we've covered so far with the mechanics of holding? Reese said, what information does ATC have to have about the area to issue an arbitrary hold? Do they need the MVA? Yes, just an MVA would do the trick, which is not published on the chart. But as long as if you're on an MVA, sorry, if you're on a, if they wanted to hold you at a random point that is not published, picture the fact that they, or picture a proxy for that operation would be them just vectoring you, them just saying, let's say you're at Quang, they could say, turn left heading 070, and then a short while later they say turn left heading 250, and then a short while later they say turn left heading 070. They're basically putting you in a racetrack just using vectors, 180-degree turns in the vectors over and over. That is essentially vectoring. So yeah, they could do that as long as you're above the minimum vectoring altitude. Okie dokie. All right, I shall move on from that. Does anybody want me to just throw in one more random non-published hold where we start with the phraseology and try and visualize it? Or are we quite happy with that and we'll move on to hold entries? I can't tell if the yes is in reference to should we do another one. Okay, one more with feeling. Okay. Let's pick somewhere less familiar. Yikes, that is scary over there. Gorman! Do it a fix so you won't have a compass rose to cheat. Thanks, Reese. The thing with fixes, though, it's 6. Yes, it could, but you're going to get reference from the airway most likely. Let's do one at raise for the fun of it. Reese, you realize that whatever I'm going to give it raise here is probably going to be in reference to Victor 107 or something, right? Oh, it just makes it harder to draw. Okay. Well, all right, I'll do this. See if this is what you had in mind, Reese. Because this, I actually think this is easier doing it at an intersection because almost certainly going to be holding along the airway upon which the intersection is based. So you kind of get a reference point already. I guess what's not clear is which side of it you'll be holding on. So let's do that. All right, so we're tootling along on Victor 107 right here, and we're heading southeast. And we get Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo. Bad news, I have holding instructions for you, advise ready to copy. Okay, ready to copy Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo. And they say Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo cleared to the raise intersection, hold northwest on Victor 107, left turns, expect further clearance at 2100, time now 2030. So read it back. All right, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo clear to raise, hold northwest on Victor 107, left turns and EFC in 30 minutes. Okay, so we get the low on route chart, and we remembered hold northwest, Victor 107, left turns. So here we are heading southeast. We know we're going to be holding northwest of raise, somewhere over here. So I'm making big mouse movements. This is how I'd be processing this when I'm first looking at it. So my area of interest is this, is what I'm getting at. I'm not yet thinking about left versus right turns. I'm just thinking I'm going to be over here. I am not, absolutely not, going to be doing anything down here because that is all south and southeast. So anything that involves me doing any holding down here is wrong. Okay, so it was northwest of Victor 107, sorry, northwest of raise on Victor 107 and left turns. So here's raise, we make a left turn, continue out, and there's our hold. Boom. That's it with left turns. And if we forget, if we couldn't quite process the left turns part, we're visualizing this, we've got the northwest part done, we've got Victor 107, we've checked our fuel, we've done those things. Now we're getting closer, and we've forgotten, shoot, was it left or right turns? Don't stress, just ask the controller. A approach Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, was that left or right turns at raise you wanted? It's just that easy. Don't make your life hard, just ask the controller. And they will not give you a hard time. They really, really won't give you a hard time about that. We know it's a high workload situation, getting ready to fly the holds. And so if you weren't able to write it all down, whatever the reason is, feel free to ask for it again, no problem. So that was our hold at raise. I will do one more that is truly evil. Basically the worst of the worst. So far we've been holding at points which are very easy to visualize. We've held at raise, we've held at the Ventura VOR, and we've held at the San Marcos VOR. Those are all points that you can point to on a map and say, cool, that's where we're holding. But how about if you're cleared to the Fillmore VOR, sorry, you're cleared to a point 10 northwest of Fillmore on the 280 radial right turns. Fantastic. So here's Fillmore down at the bottom. Our clearance limit, again, this is why I have that list in the presentation. This is why it's so important to understand each one of these and know them with certainty prior to entering the hold. Our clearance limit was not the Fillmore VOR. It was a point 10 nautical miles northwest of the Fillmore VOR. So they were giving us a point that was referencing a VOR, but only by distance. So we're not actually going to be hitting the Fillmore VOR. Okay, so it was 10 northwest of Fillmore VOR on the 280 radial. And I've even forgotten the turns. I think I said left turns. Let me check with myself. Which was that left turns or right turns? It was left turns. Okay, he said left turns. I'm glad I checked. And miles, it's somewhere around here. Let me draw it. So this is the 270. This is the 280 radial here, because this is 290, 300, 310. Okay, so this is the 280 radial here. There's the Fillmore VOR, and 10 DME. Let's see, Pyru is 10 DME. We can tell by the 10 right there. So the fix, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to change it to 20 DME instead of 10. There's too much text here. It's going to make it hard to draw. So let's do 280 DME at, sorry, 280 radial at 20 DME, 20 DME. Raise is 22 miles. So struggling. Something like that. I'm off by a couple of degrees, but there is our holding fix right there. There we go. That's the point we're going to be holding at. And it was 280 radial, northwest, left turns. Boom. Inbound leg here on the left side, outbound leg on the right side. So that's about as bad as it gets. You're holding over a fix that is very, very difficult to visually identify on a chart. So those are the times when you either tell the controller unable, if it's literally just getting too much, and say, hey, throw me a bone here. Can you get me on an airway with a fix so I have a fighting chance? Or if your workload permits it, you can attempt to visualize this. But that's when memorizing these shortcuts of, okay, if we're holding on the 280 radial, then the outbound is going to be 280. This portion of it is a 280 heading. If you memorize just that much, or if you say, okay, we take the reciprocal of 280, which is 100, so it's going to be a 100 inbound. Whichever one you want to use is up to you. But that's basically as bad as holding can get when they're clearing unpublished hold to a random DME fix. That's basically as tricky as it gets for holding, as far as I'm concerned. Reese, was that suitably evil? Very good. But notice that once you've identified, notice how quickly we went. Once we identified where the fix was, it was, with the confidence that holding northwest looks kind of like that, and we got the left turns down, it kind of took care of itself fairly quickly after that because of all the other examples we did. So whether you're holding at an NDB or a VOR or a fix or a random point in space based on DME, once you visualize that, it's really no harder to fly that hold once you're established in it. It's really no harder to fly that hold than it is doing a published hold over a VOR. You just have to set up your equipment and know that when you hit 20 DME, then you start the turn. That's about it. Okie dokie. I think we're ready to move on to slide 4. When they give you a radial, will it always be reciprocal? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep, near as I can. Oh, let me think for a sec. No. I just reversed the case. I just reversed the. Yeah, this one's. It's not always the reciprocal, no. Here's a case where it's not. Cleared to the raise intersection, hold. Just give me a second. Hold southeast on Victor 107, left turns. That ends up looking like this. Well, we said Victor 107. Let's assume Victor 107 didn't exist, and they said cleared to the. All right, I'm going to change the holding instruction for a second because Victor 107 kind of hides what's going on there. So let me change that. We're going to change it to, we know that raise is on the 310 radial. There's the 310 down there. And we know it's 22 DME. So let me clear this up. So instead it says 3 Alpha Bravo, cleared to the a point 22 northwest of the Fillmore VOR on the 310 radial. Hold south east left turns. So the point that we're cleared to is raise again, which is 310 radial, 22 DME, and they want us holding southeast of that point with left turns. So again, holding southeast means our plane is going to be generally down here somewhere, and they said left turns. So it looks like this. Okay, so they mentioned the 310 radial. Well, as it turns out, 310, we're heading away from the VOR in this case, when we're on the inbound leg. This is a phenomenon, I guess, that really only exists when you're not holding at the VOR itself. Is that correct? Yep, pretty much, as I can tell. This really only happens when you're holding at a fix further away from the VOR. So in this case, when we're inbound on the inbound leg of the hold, which is here, here's the arrow showing where we're going, we're inbound to raise, but we're actually heading away from the VOR that this was based on. So I guess that's the edge case. So your question was, when they give you a radial, will it always be reciprocal? Every example I've ever kind of practiced, it has been, so that's why I was quick to say yes. And then I thought, hang on, think, and came up with this one pretty quickly. So yeah, near as I can tell, if you're holding at a VOR, it'll be reciprocals. Basically, you almost have no choice but to visualize it. You really do have to. And again, I can't stress the importance if you are going to be doing real world flying in IMC, and I myself need to practice this, to be honest. Haven't done it for a while. Look at how much work it's taking for me to do this on the ground in the comfort of my chair on a 27-inch screen with all the time in the world and no pressure. It's still taking some brain work to verbalize this and visualize it. When you're in a plane trying to fly it with a possible fuel issue and turbulence, and you're exhausted, or whatever's going on, it is that much harder to do this. So you really want to try and get fairly good at it if you can. I'm actually glad I'm doing this because it's making me realize that I gotta work on it. At least for the non-published holds, you know, again, for these worst case scenarios. For the published, it's easier. Okay, so Geneva says, to me, it looks like we're holding southwest of the fix. Can you please explain? Sure. I won't draw it for a sec. Let's, we were using Victor 107, right? So that part is drawn. Let's just draw a north, south, east, west situation. North. There's our east-west. Questions? If we were holding southwest of the fix, it would look something like that. You know, ignoring the numbers. That would be in the southwest quadrant. It's down here. This is what holding southeast would look like. I think what may have confused you is because it was left turns, it actually resulted in, oh, I'm going to get fancy. I'm going to see if I can undo that last annotation. Fingers crossed. Yeah. And the one after it, and before it. This is awesome. After just 15 weeks of doing this, I'm learning to use the annotation tool. I think what may have confused you is we did left turns, so it kind of makes it look a little bit ambiguous, right? We've got a part of the hold, especially when I draw it like an egg. Part of it is actually existing southwest of the fix. You're right about that. But it is technically holding southeast because the inbound leg is occurring southeast of the fix. Did that help, Geneva? Alrighty. Very good. Okay. Now we move on to hold entries. I'm going to have to speed things up actually a little bit because, or I guess I'll just accept we probably won't get through tech routes if we limit it to 2 hours. And who knows, depending on how hold entries go, it may end up being that lost communications gets covered another time too. So hold entries, much is made of these. I think they're logical. A lot of people seem to get hung up on the numbers that are associated with them. And I decided a long time ago to give up on the numbers, just my own personal way of flying them. I very, very rarely think about the numbers and the headings and the number of degrees involved in the course changes. That stuff really doesn't factor into it. It really comes down to visualization. And once you've visualized it, there is only really one, possibly two correct answers. But if there are two correct answers, you're actually within your rights to choose which one you'd like to do. So normally this is a question of just ruling out entries which don't make sense and see what you have left. Sometimes it'll be very, very obvious which one is the correct one. Sometimes it will be less obvious, and in those times when it's less obvious, do whichever one you prefer of the two that might work. Because the whole overriding goal of a hold entry is to simplify and minimize the amount of maneuvering that you do. It's also generally designed to keep you on the holding side while you're maneuvering. So a quick review. When we're looking at a hold, go back to our buddy at Ventura. That hold northwest on Victor 27 as published with the left turns right there. Remember this whole area over here is good. This area over here is bad. That would be the non-holding side. So we have non-holding with an N and H for the holding side. So let's actually use this hold, since we've spent, I guess, the most time on that one. Let's use that and talk about which entries would make sense to get established in that hold. So remember at the very beginning we talked about you need to be able to visualize what the steady state hold looks like, which is what we spent the last hour and 4 minutes on. And completely separate to that is the maneuvering phase. So at some point we end up doing this over and over and over. That's great. But if at the time we were issued the holding instructions, we were down here at perch, how do we get from here at perch to a plane that is just magically sitting in this holding pattern? And that's what hold entries are designed to do. You can come up with your own way of doing it. It's actually legal to. I wouldn't do it on check ride. You will fail the check ride. But what these holding entries are designed to do, they're basically best practices. They look at all the different ways and different contortions you could have used to get the plane into that holding state, and they took the best ones that represent the simplest procedure and the least amount of maneuvering, regardless of the direction that you're coming from. So it's 3 tools that you can use to go from wherever you are on your en route phase of flight into a hold. That's the goal of them. And again, it's vitally important. I cannot overstress this. In fact, I once got into an email exchange that went on. We had more than 75 email exchanges around this topic. I lost 2.5 days of work. This was very, very early on in PilotEdge. There was a guy who swore blue in the face that the hold entry that I suggested he use, it was on one of the pilot training program flights, he said it doesn't make sense that you have to make a left turn during the hold entry because this hold is depicted as right turns. So he was unable to grasp the concept at the time that the maneuvering that you do during the hold entry is different than in terms of the direction of the turns, i.e. left turn versus right turn, can be different from the steady state hold. So let's talk about what the different hold entries are and apply them to this particular situation. Okay, so because we're going to need that hold depicted there, I'm going to draw it one last time in a distinctive color. Actually, let's use a not so distinctive color. We'll stick with what we had, and I'm going to use the hold entry in a distinctive color. So this is what we're shooting for. There's our hold. That should not be news. We've been doing that for over an hour, so we're good. That's good stuff right there. There are 3 different hold entry techniques that are published by the FAA. These can be found here. What a shame that the annotation remains there. They're called the parallel procedure, the teardrop procedure, and the direct entry procedure. I'm going to paste that into the room here so that it's there for everybody at a later date. And just scroll down about 80% of the way down. You can see by my scroll bar here that it's further down. We're not going to necessarily read through this word for word, but if you're looking for some more detail on it later, this is where you can read about it and hopefully take the example we're about to do now and read through those procedures and say, okay, that's, those are the actual numbers they're using. Okay, let's talk about the simplest one first, the direct entry. Okay, let's assume we're actually on Victor 27 when we receive the hold. So situation 1 is we're at Ojai and we're on Victor 27 and we're southeast bound. We need to enter this steady state hold. I'm not going to draw it with emphasis, but we've done this a few times now, so you know that this is the state we're looking for. We ultimately have to get ourselves neatly established on Victor 27 heading southeast bound. That's really the goal here. Hey, good news. We're on Victor 27 and we're southeast bound. There's nothing to do. So we hit Ventura and we just fly the hold. So that is a direct hold entry. I won't actually draw that one because it will literally directly overlap with that hold, but let's do something that's kind of close to it. Let's say we were at this point right here where the 17 is. If we needed to enter that hold, it's close enough procedurally. And when I say close enough, what I'm really getting at is if you were to do a direct hold entry, i.e. simply turn to the outbound leg. So we're here. Don't ask me what the inbound heading is. It really doesn't matter that much. We're just visualizing if that was our direction of flight, essentially south-southeast bound, and we hit the VOR and we started a left turn and we joined the outbound holding course, and we keep going around. That works pretty well. The only thing that happened is potentially because we were heading further south than when we were on Victor 27. So when we're on Victor 27, we were southeast bound. In this case, we're south-southeast or south. It's going to take us more longer to make that left turn to the outbound leg. So as a result, we will probably, and it's no accident that I drew the red line the way I did, even though it probably looks like it. That's why it took us further south than the original course that I drew. But it would be by less than a mile, and it just doesn't matter that much. So the way the terrain protection is set up, it allows you to overshoot it by a certain amount. So without even looking at the numbers, that works pretty well. At some point, simply turning to the outbound heading is not going to cut it. So if we go back to our steady state, remove the fact that we're at Ojai, let's take the case now when where we're at Sadie. If we were at Sadie, there are two ways that might spring to mind. So there are two different hold entry techniques that are left. So we covered the direct entry. The next one is called, I think I'll do the parallel one first. So I'll actually just draw that to keep it moving fairly quick. As I said, I do have lost columns to get through as well, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker if that's all right. But if it gets too hairy, just let me know. So let's just move straight into what a parallel looks like. So in the case of Sadie, remember the steady state hold we're looking for is left turns, lest this turn into a 75-page email discussion. We're going to be making left turns. However, if we did that, if we got ourselves to Ventura and made anything that looks like a left turn, we're on the non-holding side, big time. And if we actually do a full-on left turn, that's wonderful. Yes, we could now enter the steady state hold, but look what happened during our maneuvering. During the first part of that maneuvering, we were so far into the non-holding side, it's comical. So again, the overriding idea behind hold entries is not only do they minimize your maneuvering, and I actually forgot to write this on the slide, but their goal is to also keep you on the protected side while you're maneuvering for the hold. So again, the spirit of this hold is that it happens east of Victor 27. So we need, during our maneuvering for the hold entry, we need to be in this world over here. We do not need to be over here. So here's how you make that happen efficiently. So if we're on Victor 299 northwestbound, you hit Ventura, you fly the outbound heading, and we are essentially parallel. In fact, let me redraw that slightly exaggerated to allow for the delay. So if you were to hit Victor 299 and you have no DME, just VOR, you wait for station passage, and then you begin your right turn to a 311 heading. Notice how it's not overlapping, but it's really, really close to it. Yes, we are on the non-holding side, technically, but we're on the non-holding side by just a smidgen. And the TERP's obstruction clearance criteria allows for this, the fact that we will be just a smidgen over it. We're not over here, though. We're just a smidgen over. Smidgen is a technical term. So should we turn left or right at this point? I mean, even if you don't know what a parallel hold entry looks like, what would be a better choice at this point? Should we be turning left or right? Correct. We should make a right turn. The reason we're making a right turn, despite the fact that steady state holds on Victor 27 are made to the left, we're not in one of those yet. We're still maneuvering for the hold. So we've got to make a right turn. How much of a right turn? A lot. We need to get over here. 180 degrees would put us here. That's wonderful. We're now on a racetrack going backwards. We don't want that. What you do is you keep the turn going. So 180 degrees would get us onto the basically the inbound heading, but we'd be over on the outbound leg, if that makes sense. We're not on Victor 27. We're parallel to Victor 27, pretty far away from it at this point. So we've got to keep the turn going until, and this is the way it's actually written. I don't really agree with how that's written, but you need to turn past 180 degrees, let's say that much, to eventually hit Victor 27 prior to Ventura. How much prior is not really that important, but at some point you have to hit Victor 27. I'm going to draw two different versions of it. Let's make three different versions, actually. No, just two is good. So this one's a pretty aggressive intercept. When I say the intercept, I'm talking about this angle here versus the angle of Victor 27. Let's try a more shallow one. Something like that. Either one of these work very, very well. The reason that we can say we've been successful is, look, we did not end up on the non-holding side. That's really what's more important. So you go parallel for a minute typically, make the right turn, more than 180 degrees. You can either use a 45 intercept, a 30 intercept. Let me just have a really quick look to see what they say. I believe it's not actually specified in the procedure. If we read a parallel, here it is. I apologize for the annotation. I don't want to get rid of my annotation though, so just deal with it for now. When approaching the holding fix from anywhere, blah, 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 turn in the direction of the holding pattern through more than 180 degrees and return to the holding fix or intercept the holding course inbound. They actually say you can, you could do this. You could simply go straight to Ventura from that point. Isn't it ironic that that's one of the cases we actually drew before, was arriving from that area? And yes, you could do it that way. I feel much more comfortable, and every person I've ever talked to, when they fly parallel entries, they try and get themselves established prior to the VOR. So you're trying to get into that steady state with all the instrumentation set up nicely. So, do you want to make it a 45 intercept? In that case, it's 45 plus 180, it's a 225 degree turn. That would be option number one. Do you want to make it a 30 degree intercept? 30 plus 180 is 210. You could make it a 210 degree turn. I don't care which. I generally shoot for about a 30 degree intercept so that it's not so much of a rude turn back to the left to hit the airway. Let's take an extreme case. Let me clear up some of this if I can. Good. Let's take an extreme case. I'm so glad there's an undo, where you just literally keep turning until you intercept. Something like that. You've now got a 90 degree intercept. Thanks for making that a circle. A 90 degree intercept is awkward. Yes, you've intercepted way outside of Ventura. Congratulations, that's great. However, you now have a 90 degree left turn to make to get back onto Victor 27. Well, by the time you hit Victor 27 on a 90 degree angle and start making a left turn back, hey, you're onto the non-holding side. So that's why I'm not really wild about, I should say, doing ridiculously steep intercepts. And I've never seen anyone advocate a massively steep intercept on the way back in on a parallel hold entry. So don't get too caught up on the number. It's really just whatever. I guess try it different ways and see what you like. The steeper the intercept, the further out you'll intercept from the VOR, that's great, but also then the bigger a turn you have to make to get established on the airway. So find something in the middle that works for you. So let's draw one, just one clean one. Hit the airway, inbound, and now you're into the steady state. So a parallel hold entry flies in the face of the direction of turns for the steady state hold. If this is a left turn in the hold, I guarantee that the parallel hold entry is going to involve right turns. If it was right turns being made in the hold, then a parallel hold entry would have been left turns to get established in the hold. So don't get too hung up on that. It's perfectly fine. All that matters is whether you stay on the holding side or not. That would be parallel hold entries. They're one of my favorites to do. We only have one left, the teardrop hold. Let's say we're actually going to do two. We're going to do one which is very, very clearly a teardrop hold, and then we're going to do one that's right on the border between the two, and you'll see why I don't care which one you do. and why I don't bother dealing with numbers. Because there are hard numbers associated with when you transition from one to the other, but they drive me nuts. And I can't remember them properly on the ground. And I don't know many people that do. And in the air is when you see them fall apart even more. Because they're holed up. They're trying to visualize just the numbers, and if you don't get it just right, you end up with a completely inaccurate hold entry that causes more trouble than it's worth. So I'm bigger on the concepts and visualizing roughly when they should be used. And if it's so close that you can't tell the difference between one and the other, then it really doesn't matter which one you use. Okay, let's do one that's very clearly a teardrop. So we're arriving from our buddy Perch. Here's Perch over here. I lie. I'm going to use Victor 208 because it is perfectly set up for a teardrop. We're arriving at Victor 208. Here's the teardrop. By doing absolutely nothing at all, we're already on the non-holding side. We go out for a minute, and we simply make the left turn to intercept. And we come back in. And it's called a teardrop because it looks a bit like a teardrop. If that's the tear duct right there, and we're in zero gravity or negative 1g, and the tear is falling up, then you have a teardrop shape. Let's see how they describe that one. Teardrop. When approaching the field from the fix from anywhere in sector B, which was over here, this is B, there's our holding fix. Turn outbound to a heading for a 30-degree teardrop entry within the pattern for 1 minute, then turn in the direction of the holding pattern to intercept the inbound holding course. Right. So you're basically trying to set up a 30-degree angle between the inbound heading and, well, I should say the outbound heading and you. So if this was 311, 311 is the outbound heading, you would just add 30 to that. And that's one of the few cases where there is a hard number. It's supposed to be plus 30. So this would be 341 would be outbound. That's why I chose Victor 208, because it's so closely aligned to it. If we undo that and do the less perfect example, which is Perch, you come from Perch, hit Ventura, and then you fly a 341 heading. How do I know it's 341? Because 311 plus 30 is 341. Go for a minute, and then make the left turn to intercept. So here's where it gets a bit, sorry, any questions on the teardrop before I move on to, well, what if it's right on the line? Feel free to type away if you do have a question, but otherwise I'm going to move on. So let's do one that's right on the line. And by on the line, I mean on the line between parallel and teardrop. That's usually the one that seems to occur. Let's take Victor 25 from exert. So if we're at exert and we get that holding instruction, there's two different ways that you can approach it. There are people who prefer teardrops, and here's why people prefer teardrops, at least as far as I know. Because once you start the turning, the bulk of the turning in a teardrop matches the direction of the turns in the hold. So let's draw the teardrop from exert. 341, yes, you made a right turn, not a very big one, but now things are pretty easy. It's all left turns from here, right? Left turn to intercept, left turn for steady state holding. So it's all left turns, very neat. Except for the fact that you had to make a slight right there. So you had to make a right, then a left. Compare that to the parallel version of that same thing. Go out for a minute, right turn, big right turn, re-intercept, left turn, then all left turns. Which one's better? I can't really answer it. It's personal preference. But those are the different mechanisms. So if you want more details on those and more details about the numbers where you do, visualizing the sectors, I should say, then the aim is a good place to go. I wish their diagram was a little bit higher quality, but it has the sectors A, B, C, and D very well defined, and it shows each of the entries. And it is worth examining that when you have time to relax and really look through it and apply it to different hold entries. And that can be kind of fun to just pick these random fixes and visualize how you would hold coming from any random direction. Okay, I'm going to move on to lost comms because we do still have time to do it. I don't really have any more to add on holding. I could probably do a bit more on hold entries and when to use one versus the other, but I think it's okay to explain the concepts. We've now drawn each of them. We've illustrated the fact that when it's real close, it doesn't really matter which one you use. In fact, on my IFR check ride, it was technically a parallel entry by a matter of like 4 or 5 degrees, and the DPE said that she would have actually used a teardrop entry because she prefers teardrops. So she even stated on my check ride, if it's that close, then pick the one you're most comfortable with, and she preferred teardrops over parallels. And the reason she quoted was because of in a parallel, you're turning different direction than the steady state holds, whereas with a teardrop, it's consistent. So I wanted to make sure that point was clear, and we've gone through the rest of holding, I think, and the level of detail I really wanted to cover. But we can move on to lost comms, I think, unless anyone has any questions. Okie dokie. So the most important part of a holding clearance was the expect further clearance time, which, as we said, is for lost communications purposes. So if you lose the comms while you're in the hold and you're waiting, and you can no longer reach ATC at all, what do you do next? And this is the whole world of lost communications. So for the holds, just for continuity, we'll talk about what you do in the hold. When do you leave the hold? It is at the expect further clearance time. That's why it's so important to have one of those. And if you're still in the hold and you're approaching the EFC time, if you're getting down to literally just a couple of minutes before the EFC occurs and you haven't heard anything from ATC, it's probably a good idea to check in with them. They should ping you, if they need to issue a new EFC. So for example, if the plane ahead of you that was shooting an approach into Catalina hasn't canceled IFR, and they had anticipated by now that it would have, and they see that you've only got a few minutes left on your EFC while you're holding, they might say, hey, Cessna 3 Alpha Bravo, your new EFC or expect further clearance time is, whatever 30 minutes from now is, or 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And so at any given time, you must have an EFC when you're in a bona fide hold. And it's not a bad idea as you as the pilot to be tracking that and seeing how close you're getting to it. So that's when you leave the hold. What about the route of flight? And what altitudes do you fly? What do you do when you lose communications? There's 2 general forks to go down. The first is, what kind of weather are we dealing with? If the weather is essentially VMC, then visual weather. So can you see the ground? Can you see the airports around you? Can you essentially maintain VFR? Or can you get down to VFR? Then if you see a field along the way which you could land at safely, so let's say you're in a Learjet, if you see a 2,000-foot field down there and it's screaming VMC, you don't have to land there. So it's not just a matter of can you get to any airport at all, it's can you get to a practical airport for you, for your type of airplane. And so that's the first branch. There's only 2 branches to go down. Are we going to go all the way to our destination, or are we going to try and stop somewhere ahead of time? If it's VFR, you can stop somewhere ahead of time. That's what they'd rather you do. So that the spirit behind that is the sooner you can get down, then the better, the less the load on the ATC system. Because a plane that is flying IFR without being in communication, they give you a pretty wide berth. So they clear out a fairly big path around you to allow for any kind of mistake you might make or any misinterpretation, especially when it comes to shooting approaches and what you do, which approach you shoot, etc. They're going to give you a very, very wide berth and keep planes out of the way big time. That represents a significant load on the system and reduced capacity. So they're going to they want to minimize how long that occurs for. So if you're on a 4-hour IFR flight and you lose comms 10 minutes after you take off and it's a screaming nice day, it would really help out if you just land at land VFR at the nearest practical field. So that's the first thing. If you can descend VFR, do it. If you can't, then what you do is pretty well documented. And there are two areas of it that we're going to cover. One is what is the route that you fly, and the second is what altitude are you going to fly. And we'll talk about those separately. So first we'll cover the route. So you're ultimately going to be going to your destination, and we'll talk about the routing that you'll be using. You're going to get to the destination, you're going to shoot an approach of some sort, and that will be up to you as to which approach you shoot. And you'll potentially go missed, and if you do go missed, you're then legally obliged. I guess you could shoot the approach again if you have reason to believe that you can get in. So if you just saw the field at the last second and the weather's improving, but you still had to go missed for whatever reason, it was too late, or if you just didn't fly the approach properly, whatever the reason, you could shoot the approach again potentially. But your only other option at that point, if you're not going to land at your original field, will be to go to your alternate field. That's why. So the alternate that you file really becomes important only in a lost communications situation. That's why you must have enough fuel to get to your destination, shoot the approach, and go to your alternate and still have 45 minutes of fuel, if memory serves, left for IFR. So you've got to pick that alternate fairly carefully. Picking an alternate that's 100+ miles away has real implications if you're stretching the limits of your aircraft's range to begin with. So you have to choose the alternate very, very carefully. And the alternate really, again, only becomes important in lost comms. You could file an alternate that's pretty far away, knowing that you have the fuel to do it. But if you actually go missed at your destination airport and you're in communication with ATC, a lot of people think you have to go to your alternate at that point, and that's not true. You can negotiate a new alternate in real time. And I've done that several times when I've had to, when I didn't make it into my primary airport. So you can pick up a new alternate if you like, if you have your radio working. But if you don't have your radio working, that's what you're going to be doing. So in IFR, you go to your destination, shoot the approach, and if that doesn't work out, you're going to go to your filed alternate and go shoot the approach there. That's what's happening at the big picture level. So how do you get there? That's the big question. And so the stuff which is not really debatable is the route that you use to get there. At least as far as I know, there isn't much debate over it. So here's how, this is the mnemonic that people use to remember this stuff. It's Avenue F, MEA. Really, I should redraw that as the abbreviation for avenue. So it's Avenue F, like a street address. So imagine Avenue F in a city somewhere. MEA. So Avenue F deals with the routing portion. So it goes in this priority. Whatever route you are assigned, that's what you're going to fly. So if you were cleared as filed, for example, and you lose comms during the departure, then whatever your assigned route was, that's what you're going to fly. That's the simple case. So you fly the cleared route, get to the destination, shoot the approach, Bob's your uncle. Well, sometimes it's not that simple. What if you were being, what if you were on a vector DP, or you're just simply receiving radar vectors at the time? This is why it's so important to understand when you are being vectored, what you're being vectored for. So if you're coming out of Palomar and they've got you on a 255 heading, or let's use John Wayne since that's used so frequently. Common clearance out of John Wayne would be after departure fly heading 220, radar vectors Seal Beach, then as filed. That's a pretty common one that I'm sure a lot of people here, based on the ratings that I'm seeing, people have received that clearance before. So that radar vector Seal Beach is pretty significant. So you fly the 220 heading out of John Wayne, and you're sitting there, and the radio is just quiet. So they've left you on the heading, the radio is screaming at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and suddenly it just goes dead. You try calling them on the COM2 radio, and no response either. Okay, so now we have a lost comm situation. So what do you do? So you were on the 220 heading. Why were we on the 220 heading? Because we were expecting vectors to seal beach. So in that case, you go to the fix that you were expecting vectors to. That's the second part of this, or the fallback position. So if you were left on a heading, and that heading was a temporary vector, and you were expecting a vector, and the next thing you're expecting was to be pointed towards Seal Beach, then if you lose the radio, you just go straight to Seal Beach. That's what ATC is going to expect you to do. So that takes care of the first two cases. So we're either on an assigned route or we were being vectored. That's great, but what if you were in a hold at the time and you were going to expect a clearance via new routing after that? So I've had, there are cases in the Northeast actually where they issue you what's called a short range clearance, where for reasons I'm still not entirely sure of, they can't issue you a clearance from the airport you're leaving to the airport you're going to. Instead, they issue a short range clearance. They clear you to an NDB that's about 20 or 30 miles away from the field, and that is your clearance limit. And they tell you to expect further clearance to your whatever the destination airport is via a certain routing, but you haven't gotten that clearance yet. So your initial clearance is to a clearance limit, but then you have routing you're expecting to get prior to reaching that initial clearance limit. If you lose comms, then you go via the expected route, if there was one. And the very worst case is if none of these have really come together, there's still ambiguity, then if worst comes to worst, you go with what you filed. So let's say they put you in a hold and they didn't give you an expected route after that, then you would go with whatever you had filed potentially. If there's any ambiguity between those three, then you can always fall back to what you filed. So it is handy to know what it was that you filed. That covers the lateral routing from where you are now to a point very close to the airport. Let's leave it at that for now. Let's talk about the altitudes next, because that's also very important too. This is where the MEA comes in. And this is like a recursive definition or a recursive acronym. So MEA stands for 1, the MEA, 2, expected altitude, or 3, the assigned altitude. It's the highest of those three. So if we take a case where we are, let's see, we can go through all three of those actually. Let's assume we are cruising along on Victor 299 and our assigned altitude is 5,000 and we're westbound. Yes, that might make some of you twitch because 5,000 that's the wrong altitude for direction of flight, but this is a radar environment and ATC can assign whatever they want. They've given us 5,000. So we're cruising along on Victor 299 and let's assume our routing is to, we're heading up to San Luis Obispo or something like that. And the routing is Victor 299, Ventura, Victor 25, out to Paso Robles. Okay, and our assigned altitude is 5,000. So we do that, then the radio gets weak, lights start flickering, and then we lose them. So we have a problem once we cross Ventura. Our assigned altitude is 5,000, but the MEA for the segment we're about to be on is 6,000. So yes, we were told to maintain 5, but we have an MEA to contend with here of 6,000. So in that case, the higher altitude wins. It's not that the MEA is more important than the assigned. They have equal priority. It's just whichever one is higher. So in that case, we would climb up to 6,000. Let's modify the case slightly to where ATC said, maintain 5,000, expect 8,000 after Ventura. And so maybe there's something going on with traffic. We have some oncoming traffic at 6,000 or something like that. And so they say, for now, maintain 5,000, expect 8,000 after Ventura. Okay, great. That expect 8,000 is not just to give you a heads up that it's coming. it has legal ramifications too for lost comms, and here it is. We now have an expected altitude that is, in this case, it's not based on time. It's not expected after 5 minutes or 10 minutes, which we'll cover in SIDS in just a minute, regular IFR clearances off the ground. We're all familiar with that phraseology of maintain 5,000, expect 9,000 5 minutes after departure. We'll cover that in a sec, but in this case, it's based on crossing a VOR. So now we have 3 altitudes that are interesting. We were told to maintain 5, the MEA is 6, and we were told to expect 8. Those are our 3 variables. Again, it's not that one has higher priority over the other, just as well, because memorizing that would be a pain. It's really just whichever one is highest. So 8,000 wins, and so that's what we do. We cross Ventura, we climb to 8, and we maintain that. That's our new altitude, minimum altitude, until, in this case, San Marcos. Because at San Marcos, the party starts again with Victor 25 climbing up to an 8,600 feet MEA to Weiner, as far as Weiner. In fact, there's also a crossing restriction here. I actually like that. That's a good one. Glad we're covering it. So there's an MCA, minimum crossing altitude. So if it's going to be Victor 25, we'll be going on northwest bound. We have to cross San Marcos actually at 7,600, climbing to 86. So that's something you'd want to identify prior to reaching San Marcos. But that's okay because we're at 8,000 anyway. So we're cruising along at 8,000. The minimum crossing altitude is 7,600. We're above that, so we're good. We hit it at 8,000, and then we start a climb to 8,600, heading northwest bound. Okay, that covers the altitudes and the routing. Where it gets interesting is what happens if your route of flight doesn't end in an initial approach fix or a feeder. And what you're supposed to do is go to the airport. You would proceed to the airport in theory, and from the airport you would go direct to an initial approach fix from which you shoot an approach. And that is why some people get very uncomfortable, or in fact their airplanes may not be equipped to do that, with receiving a routing that doesn't end in initial approach fix. So let's assume our destination was, for example, Paso Robles, right there. And we assume our routing took us through Victor 25 to the Paso Robles VOR, then direct. Well, what if there were no actual approaches that were shootable from Paso Robles? Let's assume, for argument's sake, that the only approach, and this is a stretch, but the only approach that could be flown at Paso Robles was actually from Jebno over here on Victor 248. There are people who would be much, much more comfortable receiving routing that included Jebno. So what they'd really want is routing that says Victor 25, Paso Robles, Victor 248 to Jebno direct. In that case, there's no ambiguity as to what you're going to do in the case of lost comms. The route that you've been cleared for ends at a fix from which you can shoot an approach. That's great. So where it gets a bit more ambiguous is, well, what happens if you get to Paso Robles and that's the end of your routing and you now need to get to Jebno? How do you do that? That's a little bit beyond the scope of the sort of discussion. You can read the regs about that side if that part is of interest to you. But the high level is that you would, in theory, you go all the way to the airport, and from there you go to a fix from which you can shoot the approach of your choice. Fascinating. There's also questions about timing, and I won't spend long on this, but there's questions about the, let's assume that we hit a radical tailwind, and we had filed an en route time of 1 hour and 30 minutes. So like good pilots, prior to taking off or just as we receive the takeoff clearance, we write down what our wheels up time was. So let's assume it was an 1.5 hour flight and we are departing right at 1:30 p.m. then our estimated time of arrival is going to be 3 o'clock if it's a 1.5 hour flight. So we know at our wheels up time, it's literally 1:30 when we get off the ground. Fantastic. Okay, we've got that scribbled away on a piece of paper somewhere. We then lose comms, and by the letter of the law, if we continue along the cleared route and we hit those tailwinds and we get there, say, 10 minutes sooner, we are supposed to actually hold prior to shooting the approach. We're supposed to hold until our arrival time and then shoot the approach. There is not a controller in the land that I have spoken to that is expecting this to happen. I have literally not been able to find one. So let's say we don't do that. Let's say we just throw that out the window and we get to Paso Robles and we shoot the approach. Here's what's not going to happen. We get there 10 minutes early. We are not going to encounter another aircraft that ATC has decided to sneak in ahead of us because ATC was expecting us to hold for 10 minutes while we hit our estimated arrival time. That's not going to happen. As I said, they clear a very wide berth. They don't even really have easy access to your en route time, from what I understand. They have to go and dig that up, dig deep into the computer or make phone calls or call flight service. I can't quite remember which one of those three it is, but it certainly doesn't just pop up on their screen, and they don't get spoon-fed that information. So again, they don't want a Nordo aircraft with no radio, just holding there arbitrarily, waiting for some time to elapse before they go in. Again, I've spoken to quite a few controllers about this, and every one of them says, oh, please, shoot the approach, get down, get out of our hair, because they would have cleared the path long ago. And so holding really doesn't serve much purpose there. I guess theoretically you could say, well, what if there's another plane that's lost comms into Paso Robles at the same time? And I would just say it's not going to happen. It just doesn't happen. So you could do the what ifs forever, and that's usually where these debates end up going. Is okay, well, what if there are two heading there with lost comms? Then if they stuck to their ETAs, etc., then they're less likely to hit each other, and you're just getting into such unlikely territory that it's very unlikely that the lost comms case is rare enough, let alone two simultaneous lost comms into the same airport at about the same time. So that's where the debate starts happening. Is what if you arrive early? Do you hold or not hold? And you can treat it as, remember, for any regulation that's written, if you are experiencing an emergency, you're allowed to deviate from any regulation at all to the extent required to meet your emergency. So if you have a lost comm situation, that is somewhat of an emergency in and of itself, in the sense that you don't know what caused that lost comms issue. There could be other electrical issues which are progressively getting worse the longer that plane is in the air. And so you could very easily pull rank and just say, oh, I treated it as an emergency and I landed at that destination airport as soon as possible. That's why I didn't hold for 10 minutes at Paso Robles. Yes, the option of carrying a spare radio is often mentioned as a case. Practically speaking, unless you can hook that radio up to the antenna of the airplane, it's going to be useless. So if you have a little handheld radio, it's going to be virtually useless inside the airplane. The antenna is just so small and the transmitter is so weak. But if you can wire your antennas such that there is basically a spare coax cable hanging out of the glare shield, and you can unscrew the little rubber ducky antenna that comes on your handheld and screw that into the plane, then you have a fighting chance potentially. It's probably still not going to be as strong, but with any luck, you can make that work. Those spare radios are tricky to set up for that reason alone. Getting that antenna on there is non-trivial. And then hearing it is tough. You've got to get the right cables to hook that up into your headset as well. So you're probably going to unplug the headset from your intercom and try and plug it into the spare radio that you're carrying if you're doing all that. This is sort of the beauty of the IFR system. If you don't have a spare radio, it shouldn't kill you. If you've done all the planning correctly, lost comms is a giant inconvenience for ATC. It shouldn't be a threat to the safety of your flight. So I wouldn't bend over backwards to try and reestablish that ATC link. I mean, give it a try, but not to the point where you're you're fiddling and fussing with that, and if you don't have an autopilot, while you're fiddling and fussing with that, you forget to fly the plane and you spiral to your death. That would be counterproductive. So first and foremost, fly the plane. Don't sweat it too much, even though it's very, very uncomfortable, I would imagine, to fly an auto. It is, you're not going to get hit by another IFR aircraft. That's what it boils down to. So yes, it's scary to be in the soup, not talking to anyone. That's not a comfortable situation to be in, but you can rest assured that ATC is working very, very hard to keep those paths clear. Again, giving you a very wide berth, from what I understand, laterally and vertically, and giving you room to execute the route that you've been cleared for. So that's why it's very important to understand the route that you've been given and know what you're going to do. But if you stick to those rules, do the altitudes as I've described and fly the cleared route, then no harm will come to you. And the system's actually very elegant that way. And that's why it becomes important to know how to shoot full approaches too, because if you're going to, you're not going to be getting vectored to final. So if you're in the soup, that's a good time. That's when you're going to be shooting that ILS full approach procedure. Yes. When would you squawk 7600? When you can no longer, when you suspect you're in a lost comms situation. So there is a squawk code assigned. There is a special squawk code that implies that you've lost radio communications, which is 7600. So 7700 is an emergency squawk, and 7600 is the no radio squawk. So you would squawk the 7600. Excellent. So those are the general points of lost, what to do for lost comms. So that acronym of the Avenue FMEA is very, very handy. So you can give yourself scenarios, and you can even practice them on PilotEdge if you like. We have had a few people who have done it, not intentionally, but they have lost either two-way comms or sometimes they've lost one-way comms. They squawk 7600, but I'll still issue one or two instructions in the hopes that they're able to hear me, but I can't hear them. And in some cases, it was a complete failure of comms. They couldn't hear anything I was saying. And in other cases, they were still able to hear me. So I would give them, say, a turn or a climb. And if they complied with it, then I would know that I still had comms with them. So I then set up, tell them what my intentions are going to be, and we can still vector them from approaches. In that case, come up with contingency plans of, okay, I actually remember doing this for one gentleman who lost. We had one-way comms, and he was heading into Fullerton. And I said, okay, here's the weather for Fullerton. It's reasonable VFR. To minimize your workload, I'll go ahead and set you up for a visual, and I'll point you towards the airport. This is the altitude I will be getting you down to. If I see you go below that altitude and directly towards the field, I'm going to assume that you're shooting the visual approach, and at that point, I'll hand you over to the tower, and you can receive one-way instructions from the tower. If you never go below the altitude I gave you, then I'm going to assume you don't see the field. And so I'll let you fly over the field at that altitude, and at that point I will vector you for this approach, and this is the approach it's going to be. So have that plate ready. And so, and this was still, I think, 30 miles away from the field. So he had plenty of time, and he ended up shooting the visual and landing without incident. So one-way comms is better than no comms, but had it been a two-way comms failure, I would have known what it is he should be doing. And so don't feel, I guess the last thing I'd say is don't feel the need to be creative. Don't feel that you have to suddenly get down and land at another field in IFR. So don't fly to a field that we weren't expecting you to fly to. What you are expected to do is do the Avenue F MEA. So continue to the field of that you had cleared to. Again, this is if it's IMC. So don't be creative and say, oh, well, I'm going to help them out and go to this other airport instead. Because if you suddenly go to the other airport, they may not have shut down the arrival path at that airport. And it'll take them a while to realize that, oh, they're actually going into Burbank instead of Fullerton. That's good to know. And they have to get all the Burbank arrivals out of the way. So what they are expecting you to do is go all the way to the destination. And that can be uncomfortable. I mean, if you were going to LAX or something, that's a real shame. Because they would then shut down the LA arrival corridor, but that is what they will do. And if you attempt to do something else, it will be a surprise to them. Again, if it is IMC. So if you see a field below you and it's VFR and you can get down to it, then do that, and that would be fine. But just make sure it is VFR. because you really are on your own for separation, if they're not expecting you to be going there. Okay, I've harped on enough about the wonderful world of lost comms. Well, it has happened. We've got about 10 minutes left, given that I started about 5 minutes after. I can cover tech routes. There really is not a ton to tech routes. So I believe without rushing really at all, I think I can actually get tech routes done. I was almost going to say, look, we've got 10 minutes left. We should probably call it a day. But as I said at the very, very beginning, the tech routes were going to be the lightest, shortest part anyway. Holding was the heavy one, lost comms is in the middle, and tech route is very, very light. So I'm happy to do tech routes, and if for some reason we do run out of time, I'll extend it into another workshop. But I think we actually have time to do it. So Geneva asked a good question. Would you ever squawk VFR if you can complete the flight VFR, or do you stay 76 all the way down? That's a good question. I would keep the 7600 all the way down, because the field that you might be going to in VFR could be a towered airport, and they might either be a full radar tower where they have a full radar display, or they might be a LRAC tower where they have limited radar, and them knowing that you're the 7600 guy is important. If you just squawk VFR, then you kind of blend into all the other VFR guys, and they may be kind of surprised to have a non-radio VFR aircraft showing up. So I would keep the 7600 the whole way down. I guess the only time you might consider that would be if it's VMC and you're landing on a non-towered field. I guess you could potentially make the argument that you could squawk VFR and they'll essentially forget about you, but that seems unlikely. I think I'm leaning towards just 7600 the entire time. ATC knows that you're going VFR to an airport if you end up going anywhere other than what your filed destination was or what your cleared destination was. So if you are en route and you suddenly start circling over a field and gently spiraling down, and they look up the weather for that field and they see it's VMC, that tells them you're going to be VFR into that airport. But if it's IMC at that airport and you're spiraling down, that would be a very big surprise to them. Mike, you're saying what's the advantage of switching? You mean why would you bother switching to another destination? The sooner you can land, the better. Oh, I see. Why would you bother switching? Yes, the squawk code. Gotcha. There's only one case I can think of, and it seems it's really an edge case, which is where you squawk 1200, you essentially cancel your IFR and then continue doing your own thing for an undetermined amount of time. So if it's a screaming nice day, and you decide and you had filed to a non-towered airport anyway, and you lose comms, you might decide, you know what, I'm just gonna. I know what the radio problem is. I can, but I want to continue the flight anyway. By squawking 1200, that would be sending a message that, I'm just going to do my own thing, and I'll be staying out of airspace where communication with ATC is required, for example. So that I guess would be. I can't really imagine doing it, and there may be some legal problems with doing it, but I guess that might be one case where you decide to proceed on, and you're trying to communicate to them that you're going to literally do your own thing, and you reserve the right to kind of do your own thing. That would really only happen if it was really, really good weather, I would think, that you'd go to 1200, and you've got to be going into a non-towered airport. I would keep it simple and just do the 7600 and get down as soon as you can if it's VFR, because who knows, unless you're sure about what caused the failure, I'd be very concerned about other electrical issues. So if it's VFR, get down as soon as you can, squawking 76. Otherwise, if it's IFR, stick with the plan and go to the destination. Now that said, I don't want to give the wrong advice, but if you're smelling like an electrical fire, or if you really are very, very concerned that something else might be going on, even if you can't smell a fire, and it's IFR, and you need to go either to where you just came from or the nearest airport with an approach, squawk 7700 then, if you, at that point too. If you're going to treat it like an emergency and you're going to deviate from the Avenue F, I would squawk 7700 at that point, because now we're going from a radio failure to a bona fide. You're pulling the emergency, and you're going to do something other than Avenue F, which is deviating from the regulations at that point. So I would squawk the 7700 at that point, which would signify to them, okay, he's not necessarily, or she's not necessarily going to do the plan, and they wouldn't know or care what the reason is for that. That'll be taken care of in the courts or by the prosecutors later as to whether it was justified for you doing that or not. But that would be the last concern you have. If you need to declare silently with 7700 and get down in IMC at the nearest airport, do it, and they will get the planes out of the way. It won't be pretty, but they'll get the idea of what you're trying to do. Okay, well, with that in mind, I think there's probably going to be more discussion about LOSCOM, so I think I will actually skip the tech routes unless there's overwhelming votes to try and continue. It only takes about 10 minutes to do tech routes, or 15 minutes, but I could easily make that the topic of another one, the next workshop potentially. Just a brief intro before the main topic of what the next workshop was going to be.